I just want to give a little spiel about what Artful Minds is. And Artful Minds focuses on artists' artistic development and growth by providing exercises, inspiration, instruction, guidance, discussion, and feedback all in one place. We provide weekly skill development exercises, weekly open office hours where you can come and ask me anything, monthly challenges, monthly critiques, inspirational interviews like we're having tonight, and upcoming master classes. If you want to check us out, it's pretty easy. Just go to artfulminds.ca. And if you want to catch some of the other interviews, you can check it out at community.artfulminds.ca in the open studio section. Let me just highlight David here. Tonight's inspirational interview is with David Shevlino. He's an oil painter based in North Carolina who is known for his looser paint application, which straddles the line between representational painting and abstraction. His paintings are characterized by broad brushstrokes, a sensuously application of paint, and an obvious feel for tonal harmonies. Welcome, David. How you doing?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
Thank you. I really appreciate you agreeing to do this interview.
More than happy.
I am going to share my screen of some of your work. And if you could just introduce yourself in your own words, that'd be fantastic.
Well, as Michael said, my name is David Shevlino. I'm an American painter, a figurative painter. I live in North Carolina presently, and went to school in Philadelphia in the 1980s. And I've been professional, more or less a professional painter ever since. I also teach, painter/instructor.
And do you do any Zoom instruction at all, or is it all in person?
I don't really do Zoom instruction. I prefer to teach one-on-one or face-to-face. I feel like I'm a lot better at that.
Yeah, I think it gets across what you're trying to articulate way better when you're in person, for sure.
Well, especially if you're someone like myself who often take the brush of a student and work on their painting to fix something. My experience, the few occasions when I've done online teaching, I had this impulse to try to put my hand through the monitor.
Oh, no way.
to grab the paintbrush.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so first question here. Like many artists, you start off on the path of sort of a realism and something with a lot of detail. But what pulled you away from that?
Well, my schooling or my background was very traditional, very classical when I was first beginning to paint in my teens. And also when I attended art school, I was very much influenced by classical and traditional painting methods and old master painters. I painted that way for a decade or so out of art school. And then at a certain point, I felt this nagging feeling that I wanted to try to do something else, to move in another direction or in a direction that I'd never gone before. And that started the ball rolling to doing experimental paintings and then fast forward 25, 30 years and what I'm doing now.
Yeah, that must have really put you out of your comfort zone then, eh? Especially if you're coming from more of a classical aspect of it.
Yes, it did very much so, because when I was a student, I had a very narrow or a very narrowly defined idea of what painting was about. And as you said, it was very uncomfortable for me personally to push outside of my comfort zone, to go outside of my box. That didn't come easily for me.
Yeah, I don't think it comes easy for anybody to change what they want to do, right?
Well, I guess not. Some people are more adaptable than others, I guess. And some people they seem to be perfectly content to just do the same thing year after year after year. But as an artist, that's not the kind of an artist that I am. That's not really what I want for myself. So I'm always trying to push and try different things. Otherwise, I seem to become bored.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, but ever since you found your way, though, I mean, with your large, bold brushstrokes, your controlled brushstrokes as well, I mean, that's been with you now for quite a while, and it doesn't seem like you're getting bored of it at all, right?
No, and it has been a few decades now that I've been painting the way that I paint, or at least paint the kind of painting that most people are familiar with. I wouldn't say that I'm bored with it. I don't know what I'll be doing in a few years, and someone was asking me about that just recently. I'm open. I like to keep it. I like to keep my options open, so I reserve the right to do whatever I want, whenever I want.
I love that attitude. That's great.
I mean, let's put it this way. No one becomes an artist or a painter for any other reason other than because they love it. So I may as well get the benefit of being able to do whatever I want. I'm not in it for the money, that's for sure.
Uh, I won't go down that road
Right.
because we all know the answer, I think. Now, I first came. I'm going to share my screen, and this painting of the sumo wrestlers. I came across it. I don't know, 2012 or something like that, and I can't remember where. But I was just in awe of it because it had a lot of feeling of struggling and movement in it, and I've never really seen it before at that time when I did see it. The brushwork plays a large role in your work. Can you talk about it and how to improve what you kind of coined as the economy of the brushstroke?
Well, I guess I could just start by saying that I agree with what you said about the two figures. That what drew me to the sumo wrestlers, and by the way, I don't have any particular connection to sumo wrestlers. I've never been to a sumo match. Some people have asked me that, but the idea of these two massive figures struggling to overcome one another is what really drew me to that. And I think that the way that I paint, the paint application itself, was that subject really lent itself to a loose economical paint application. So I think that the two went together pretty well. The economy, I guess, has to do with just distilling all of the information that you're looking at. And it's, again, this is very different than the way that I was taught to draw and paint when I was in school, because it was I had a much tighter, more literal approach to drawing and painting. So becoming more economical, over many years, as I said, it's just a matter of distilling visual information and having to make decisions about what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there. The irony is that if you say, economy or simplifying things, not really a simple thing to do, actually, like to literally do it, because there's so much, because of the decision made. So it's not like painting something very literally where you've got this subject in front of you and you're being very literal about every little detail of it. That's a different kind of a painting. I almost find that at this point a little less challenging. What I find more challenging is if I'm limiting the number of brush strokes that I'm using, or I'm using a very large brush, I have to be very deliberate about, where does this brush stroke go? Because I'm limiting the amount of information.
Gotcha. So, with this idea of economy of brushstrokes, though, you're quite deliberate. Like you'll be looking for a shape and you'll put it in, and you might go over it another time, but it's slightly a different direction. So it looks
Right.
like each time you put in a brushstroke, you're saying to yourself, "I'm putting in a brushstroke." And to me, I find that really fascinating because you're looking for that shape of that value of whatever is on your brush, and you're putting it in, and then you might cut over it with another brushstroke of another value that you see that is in front of it, kind of thing like that, right? How long did it take you to build up that process instead of just being more literal? Because that takes a lot of concentration, does it not?
Yes, it does. Actually, it took me a while. It took many years. Yeah, it certainly didn't happen overnight. It's almost like if you think of painting as a language, which I do, it's like going from one language to another language, because everything that you're trying to express is you're trying to come up with a different syntax and a different way of putting, well, they're not words or thoughts that are expressed in words, they're thoughts that are expressed in paint. To answer your question, yeah, the analogy I think of is it's like a different language. And it took me a while to get a handle on that. And I ruined a lot of paintings, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Now, looking back in retrospect, I always tell students that ruining paintings or trashing paintings it's not a bad thing, because it's a great learning experience, and it's what was necessary for me to develop the way that I paint now.
Well, no doubt. I mean, it's the same as your classical training. Like, how many drawings did you ruin before you had that perfect cast drawing, right? It's the same principle, is it not?
Right. Although I think I ruined less drawings because I was going about it in a more clearly defined way. In other words, the process there is more like you go from A to B to C to D, whereas when I began painting and experimenting, with different ways of painting, and the way that I paint now, it's not as much of a linear approach. It kind of can go back and forth, forwards and backwards. It's just not as straightforward. So there's a lot more experimenting, and there's more left up to chance.
Gotcha.
So I think I ruined less when I was in art school.
That's funny. So it seems like when you're trying to find or get away from where your classical approach, it kind of sounds to me like I just assumed you'd had a direction that you want to paint more loosely and more boldly, but maybe not. Maybe you're just trying to find what was next in you. What was
Yeah,
the process?
I don't think I would describe it as I was painting this way when I was in school, and now, I'm out of art school for 10 or 12 years, and now I want to paint in this style, because the truth is I didn't really have an idea of what that style would be. I knew that I wanted to change and I wanted to try something different that was more personal, that had more to do with interpreting subject matter, maybe even more narrative. But I really didn't know what form it would take. So I didn't know what else to do but to start experimenting with what I knew about painting. And those first few years of doing that they were very messy.
Well, I can imagine. I always just assumed you had a more defined direction when you progressed into this style, but not at all, eh?
No,
Wow.
not very, no, not very defined.
Wow. You must have had a lot of faith in yourself, eh?
No, actually, no. It was very unnerving because
Interesting.
I felt very insecure at first. I remember when I first started doing experimental paintings, which in the early 90s, I would get these large boards and then large brushes. I had some vague ideas. I would do some sketches, and then I would just kind of go to the board and start painting. And at first, I didn't really know quite what I was doing, but I just kept painting and just kept at it until I saw something happening and said to myself, well, that little passage there or that spot over there, I kind of liked what happened there. And it was those moments that helped me to keep going on and propelled me to go forward.
That's good. So even though you're painting what ultimately was a bad painting, you had this one little piece that gave you your direction that continued on and kind of progressed into what you are today then, right?
Yeah, like I said, I ruined a lot of canvases, and I think I did a bunch of bad paintings. But the thing about that and learning, or at least my style of learning, is that you learn so much from the mistakes that you make. And I always try to encourage students, or encourage them in that, telling them it's okay to make mistakes. Don't get too precious about what you're doing, because then you're stepping in the way of your own progress if you get too precious about it, and you're afraid to make a mistake or a bad brushstroke or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, for myself, that's how I developed into painting the way that I do now, for better or for worse.
No doubt. Once you get into that mentality of it's not a precious painting, it sure frees you up in terms of what you're willing to try as well, doesn't it?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's this inhibition. I've gotten a lot better at that nowadays. Every now and then, I still feel sometimes I might get locked into that, but I've gotten much, much better at it because I've developed better habits, and I think I know myself better. But yeah, the inhibition, it can really get in the way of creativity.
Now, for those who don't want to spend years finding themselves or finding a way to paint more broadly like David does, he does have a wide variety of instructional videos on his website, from economy of brushstrokes to values and the color, I think. You have quite a variety, don't you?
Yeah, drawing and abstracting a figure, and there's probably, I don't even remember.
Yeah, there's quite a few, and they're all economical. So if you want to head to davidshevlino.com, they're all there for you to find.
Operators are standing by.
Yeah, that's right. For a bonus. Um,
Order
okay, I take
now.
that back. I'm not helping them out. Talking about your painting process and stuff, what then inspires you to paint something? For the sumos, you kind of talked about it a little bit in terms of the clash of these two large figures. But for some of your other stuff, like even some of your still lives to your figurative work, what really inspires you to paint them?
Well, I think I would answer that by saying there are different levels of inspiration. Some things inspire me in a more personal way, like the sumos, or some figures that, for instance, they speak to me, or there's something that internally, resonates for me. And then there are things that, are more simple in terms of subject matter or narrative, like be a still life or a landscape. And then I'm mostly inspired by the innate beauty of something. And I think what really inspires me to paint is being able to, even if it's just a simple still life, being able to capture that or paint it in a personal way that, is where I'm speaking with my own voice or expressing it the way that I see it in paint. So it's not always like some grandiose subtext or some narrative or something like that. But it's a good question about inspiration because it can sometimes be a little bit fleeting or hard to find.
Yeah, I have to agree. Now, for your still lifes, though, figurative work, I find it's a lot easier to be inspired, but even then, sometimes not. But with the still life, it really seems for me comes down to lighting and how exciting the portrayal of the objects are and the atmosphere of the lighting. Would it be the same for you, or am I totally different from you?
I would say, yeah, lighting's very important to me. And I think I have a very old school attitude about lighting, again, because I come from a traditional classical background. I started looking at old master paintings when I was a teenager. So one of my first loves was Rembrandt or Dutch painters of the 1600s. So I still love that kind of lighting.
The dramatic lighting, right?
Very dramatic. It's coming from one source, one direction. I'm a sucker for that. So I love lighting things that way and causing or creating some sense of drama. Sometimes it can almost feel like it's theatrical in a way.
Much like your boy with the mask, the green mask, I believe he is.
Oh,
Right?
right. Yeah, that was my son.
Oh, it was? No way. And just so people know what I'm talking about, I'm just going to bring him up on screen then. So that has a lot of atmosphere and mood, and for me anyway.
Yeah, that was a fun painting.
I bet. And it locks him in time too, doesn't it? It's kind of nice.
It does. Yeah, he's 23 years old now.
That's so different. Jeez.
Yeah.
We had a quick conversation before we got on here, and one of the things I mentioned to you is I think I've watched every YouTube video you're in. But one thing I picked up from one of your videos, and unless you're a watercolorist, you're always taught to paint kind of dark to light. But in one of your videos, you mentioned that you like starting with your midtone. Can you talk about that and explain why?
Well, I also learned to paint by beginning with the darks. And I painted that way for a long time. I can't really remember how long it's been or when I began starting with tones. I think it had something to do with working on a toned ground, which I do pretty much 100% of the time. The idea with starting with a mid-tone is that I just find it easier to establish the values at the very beginning if I'm starting on a toned ground with a mid-tone, and then I can work in either direction to the lightest lights and to the dark. Starting in that middle area, it just feels more comfortable.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of sketching on 50% Canson paper when you have your white pencil crayon and your charcoal, right?
Or pastel on a toned paper.
Okay, and you just find that more comfortable than, say, a solid white canvas moving into just your values.
Right. And also, well, and this might be similar or related to that. The idea of the toned ground is also because I find it kind of psychologically less intimidating. A white canvas can be a little bit scary. And I love to paint over old paintings. I'll paint right into them without even necessarily toning them first. I just find that more inviting because I like to work with what's underneath, on the canvas and then working over that. I like building layers at times if I'm, assuming I'm painting indirectly as opposed to direct. Out of that grew this love of having a tone ground, even if it's just a gray tone, and then starting with the middle tone, because it seemed to make more sense to me, just like you said earlier about working on a tone paper.
And then when we talk about tone, though, you're not the classic burnt sienna as a background. You do it more as a number 5, 50% gray, more or less, don't you?
I don't always use gray. Sometimes I use different colors. I might use a sienna color or like a bluish color. It depends on what I'm doing. Usually the way I decide it would be in terms of cool, warm. So if I'm painting a subject, say for instance, that has a lot of cool colors in it, I would probably use a warm ground. I choose a warm color as a contrast, and then vice versa. So with a figure, warm flesh tones, I probably would paint on a cooler tone. Now, the gray tone is just sort of a universal one-size-fits-all.
No doubt. I've painted on, I think everyone's always, painted on that, some sort of tone canvas at one point in their career. But I've given it up, but I've never chosen a neutral gray at all. I think I might have to try that at least once just to see what it's like.
I find gray is really nicely suited to doing figure sketches, like when I teach and do figure demos and just when I'm sketching from a model, I find the gray really seems to work well.
Yeah, I could really see that because really then all you have to worry about is kind of the lights and the darks to establish something and not worry about the rest of the face, right?
Right. And if it's just the right tone, you can almost block in just the lights and you can almost get away with leaving the tone gray. as the dark, or at least in the very beginning of the painting, I kind of think of it that way.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
but I do
Well,
go and then I paint into the dark.
that's the beauty of these interviews. Every time I talk to someone, it's like I'm gonna have to try that. So I got a list of 10 things I think I have to do now, and that's gonna be one of them, especially for figure or for portrait at least. I'm gonna give that a shot. So, but how do you like? We talked about your brushstrokes and you're working on the ground, but when it comes to painting, say you're painting for a show, what do you do? Do you work on one piece until completion, or do you have like 5 or 6 on the go and one kind of leaves, gets up, put on the ground, you pull up another one and continue the cycle?
Well, yes. And that's a habit that I started, oh, maybe 10 to 15 years ago. Just to be clear, yes, I work on several paintings, or I'll have several going, maybe 2 to 3 of them in the work at one time. And the reason for that is that before I got into the habit of doing that, I would work on one painting and invest everything in it. And I found that that just was not really healthy for me. It wasn't good for my blood pressure or my mental health. So, and I kind of thought of that as putting all of my emotional and psychological eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
So I had this epiphany once, with a painting that actually it was the painting of my son, that figure painting of him in the mask, where I got very frustrated with it and repainted it. Yeah, I was repainting it and repainting it. And finally I had to put it away for a few weeks. And then I went back to it and, looked at it again. And I was a lot calmer and not as fraught with anxiety about it. And, and then I finished the painting. But what I learned from that was that it was probably better for me, given my personality, to work on more than one painting at the same time. This way, if one goes downhill, I've got, at least there'll be 1 or 2 other ones. So
Yeah, I would think that, when you're working on another one, a little piece of magic happens. It kind of sparks inspiration. You say, oh, maybe I could kind of use that here. And
that can help.
then you get a more cohesive sense of paintings too. Would that be
Yeah,
true?
yeah, that can be helpful. Yeah, I like that. I like being able to just see more than one thing happening at a time. Also from a purely pragmatic point of view, one painting may need to dry for a few days, and then I can work on another painting,
Yeah.
and then kind of just rotate them as they're all drying.
All right, it's been just over half an hour now, so we're going to open the field to questions. One's already come in through the chat. So, do you consider your style to be disruptive realism?
I don't generally think in terms of names or titles or labels, but if I just put those 2 words together and say disruptive realism, then yeah, I guess as purely descriptive words, then I guess it is. I think I've only heard that term used a couple of times, but yeah, I guess that would be a good way to describe it.
I mean, you could also say impressionistic, representational, impressionistic realism. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
thing. There's so many different adjectives you could use to really describe your work. Let's put it on you. How would you describe your work if you were to use artist terms?
That's a really good question, because you know what, I sometimes just say, well, I'm really intrigued by whatever that space is that's somewhere in between realism and abstraction. I've never really thought of giving it a name, but yeah, disruptive realism, I guess, works as good as any. But I just feel like, why pigeonhole yourself, or why limit yourself to just, like say a genre like, well, I'm a realist and I'm an abstract painter. I mean, there's so very much that's in between that. And I think that area, that sort of whatever you want to call that area, is that's like my playground. That's what excites me. So I like using everything that I know about painting to create something, hopefully, that's unique. I feel like the more tools I have in my toolbox, having studied classical and traditional painting, I'm better off for it.
But it seems like a lot of your paintings are painted from life. What percentage is from life and what percentage would be from photos?
Actually, I do work a lot from photos. When I began painting, I only worked from life. That's the way that's the way I learned to draw and paint. And for a very long time, the idea of working from photos, especially the school I attended in Philadelphia in the 80s, that was considered taboo to work from photographs. So it took me a while, actually, to get over that. So if I had to put a number on it, I'd say these days, probably 2/3 of my paintings are from photos. And it took me a while to become accustomed to working from photos. It requires, not everyone really cares to work from photos. I mean, I know some very highly accomplished painters who, and I've heard them say things like, I can't work from photos, which is fine, because whatever it is they're doing in their work, it's just they can't do that from a photo. So I think you've got to be willing to make some adjustments in the way that you work.
Now, would I be correct, though, is that you had an advantage early on that you were working from life so much that although moving to photos might have been difficult, working from life gave you a far better understanding of what you're seeing in that photo? to help
Yes,
help you
yes,
paint it?
I'm always talking to students about how working from photographs is very challenging because there's so much, and you really need to know what you're doing as far as the nuts and bolts of painting and drawing because there's so much information that's lacking in photographs that what happens if you don't really know how to navigate your way through or around all of the pitfalls or all of the bad information or the values that are lacking or the bad color. If you don't know how to work your way around that because you don't really know how light and dark work, then you're basically gonna be copying the photograph. And I can usually tell, you can see that sometimes in paintings where you can see somebody was really just copying the photograph because they don't really know how to interpret it
Yeah.
otherwise.
So I guess the word of advice for everybody is paint from life at least part of the time so you can get a better understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I would say I don't think you can really learn to paint or draw solely from by working from photograph. I think you really need to work from life. Now, I don't think there's a problem working from photographs, but I think you can do that side by side, but just pay plenty of attention to working from life.
Yeah.
That's an important part.
Yeah, absolutely. And a related question just came about that. When you're working from photos, do you tend to print them out or view them on the screen? Do you find that there's an advantage to one over the other?
I used to print them out and I went through a lot of printing ink. And then I'm gonna say maybe 10 years or 9, 10 years ago, I decided to start working from a monitor. The monitor seems to it's just easier in so many ways. You don't have to print. The monitor seems to give better definition and resolution. And if suddenly something, you want to change something, you don't have to go back to the printer and do a completely different print. You can just play around with it on your monitor or whatever photo editing software you're using.
The thing I find about monitors or you just using your iPad is that the photos just seem to have a lot more life. Like you can really get a sense of light compared to a photo. But I mean, that's just me. I don't know what your viewpoint is.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the resolution that you can get on a screen, and I should have prefaced that by saying I'm using a high resolution screen.
Yeah, for sure.
Now I've seen students come into classes with their iPhone or their Android, and they try. We're talking about an image that looks that big. That would be challenging.
Yeah, phones are getting big, but it is a bit small. I have to agree.
At least use an iPad or a laptop.
Yeah, for sure. Even better, right? Just a question about your studio out of curiosity. Is it at home or do you have your studio at a different location?
Oh, this is my studio's at home. I mean, it's separated from the main part of the house. I don't know if I turn this around, you can, no, I don't know if you can, you can see a little bit of what's going on in there.
Yeah.
But it was a garage when we moved here, and then I figured, I don't need a garage. I'd rather have my own studio.
Oh, absolutely. It looks like a generous space too. Nice.
It's a pretty nice space. It's my studio / man cave. That's what my wife would probably tell you.
That's funny. Another question came in about kind of just finding your style. I'll just read it for you. When I challenge myself to experiment and try to move away from my usual style, it often just ends up looking like other styles I've already seen. And it makes me wonder if I should just keep painting that way, the way I usually do. Does the desire for a change of style come first, or does your style start changing on its own the more you paint?
I would say that I would think that the style of painting changes as you paint because the more that you, let's put it this way, as a student, most all students just haven't been around long enough to have fully formed ideas about themselves, let alone what they want their paintings to look like. At least that's my impression. That's the way I was as a student. So they tend to look at a lot of other work, as students often do, and they're usually influenced by instructors and other painters. And I think once you get to the point where if you've been painting a while and you've got a lot of hours under your belt, then you start having a better sense of what's possible, what's not possible, or what's not a good idea. What is a good idea? I tried to do this, that. I don't think that was for me, but I'm glad I tried it because now I know. I heard a musician once quote, he said something like, you have to find out who you're not before you can find out who you are. And I think that's a good point to make. But I think for myself, it has helped me to paint and try different things, try different styles, try different approaches, because it widens your perspective and makes you more aware of what can be possible. And then that's where individuality, I think, can start to blossom, which is ideally what we want.
Yeah, so it's almost like you let yourself evolve by progressing into all these different areas and
Right.
seeing if it works for you. If it works, it'll stick and it'll change you. And if it doesn't, you'll just come back to where you kind of are with a need to move laterally again until you find something, right?
Yeah, and
Okay.
there's lots of different directions, and that's why I told you earlier I ruined a lot of paintings because, or a lot of canvases, because I would try things, in the spirit of experimenting, but not all experiments always work 100% of the time. In fact, most of them probably don't. So you've got to break. What is that expression? You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, or something like that.
For sure, for sure. I really like the musician's quote. You got to figure out who you're not.
Yeah.
Now, your style of painting, from watching your videos, I get the impression this not the success of it, but the feel of it really comes from the brushes you use. Because I think you use long flats, and
A
you
lot
get
of
yeah, you get that strong application of the paint and that long flexible stroke, and it's probably not something you get away with a bright. And I think you
right.
use rosemary, long ivory, right?
Well, yeah. I do use rosemary ivory brushes. I use their flats, but I also use natural bristle filberts as well. So it's both filberts and flats.
But both
But
long, right?
right, because
Yeah.
they're both long. That's what I like about them. And like you said, a bright doesn't really suit me for what I'm trying to do. So yeah, a long brush that has a little bit of spring to it, so that when you load up the brush with paint and you put it down, you make a nice brush stroke, and you can. It's not something you don't want to sweep the paint away or brush it away or scrape it away.
Yeah.
Sometimes I see students that come into class with these little brushes that have been worn down to nothing, and you're shooting yourself in the foot that way.
Yeah,
Um,
it's more of a scraper than it is an applicator, right?
right?
Yeah,
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 right.
yeah. So saying that, what's the smallest brush you use these days?
Well,
Like 3/4 inch?
well, maybe literally, I might sketch out some small paintings with a brush that's maybe about a quarter inch wide, but that's just for sketching.
Okay, gotcha.
But then when I'm actually painting, I'd say maybe the smallest is probably around the really smallest one would probably be about maybe half an inch.
Okay,
And
yeah.
then, but that would be on the smaller side. The average size brush that I'm using is probably about maybe an inch.
Yeah, they seem pretty wide from the videos I've seen for sure. That kind of brings me up to you talk about your smaller sketches and stuff like that. Sometimes you will start with a smaller study before going into your large pieces.
Not too often.
Okay, so the small ones
Now,
are just the small ones and the large ones are the large ones.
pretty much, because when I'm working on a large piece, I'm usually working from a photo anyway. So the photo really serves as, I guess you'd say that serves as the sketch. I have a pretty good idea in the photo of what the painting will be like. Now, maybe if I were working from life on something large, I can see how it would be helpful to have a sketch. In fact, before I started working a lot from photos, I did do more sketches. Sometimes I'd do a charcoal drawing or something like that. But nowadays, I just tend to go directly. I might have my reference photo, and I'm thinking through that, looking really carefully at the photograph and thinking about, well, how am I going to do this, and how am I going to do that?
Oh, interesting. So you almost go direct with paint instead of, or do you just add some kind of construction lines first before applying the paint?
Just construction lines,
Okay,
basically.
yeah. So sort of the angles that you need, and then you just go into paint, eh?
Basically.
Cool.
Although, I will say, full disclosure, it doesn't always go as smoothly, the first go around.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That warms my heart, I tell you. To hear that someone like you has troubles as
Oh
well, that's
yeah,
fantastic.
I will say, and I always tell students this because there seems to be this misconception that if you're a quote unquote professional, that everything's just fine and dandy, everything's goes just swimmingly
Hmm.
first time, but it doesn't. Not for me, it does. I mean,
That's
my
good.
success rate is better now than it was 5, 10 years ago, but there's still times when something doesn't go quite right, and I have to fix something or alter it or scrape it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that, like I said, that just makes me so happy to know.
Yeah.
Actually, there was a comment, and it says your work appears to be painted solely from life, which is amazing. And they say your work has such much life and freshness. It doesn't relate to that photo quality.
Well, I would hope so. And I think that's because I learned to paint working from life. And I think I have at this point, I have a good grasp of drawing and painting. And you don't want a painting that looks like it was painted from a photograph. I'd say if that, unless, well, I mean, unless you're talking about photorealism or something like that. But I think something that helped me early on was that when I got out of art school, I did a lot of plein air painting because I no longer was painting from models since I didn't have access to them as much as I did in school. So I started doing plein air painting, and although I don't paint plein air any longer, but I did that for many years into the mid 90s. And what that experience taught me was that you have to be willing to adapt and to invent and not be too precious about what you're doing, because in a landscape everything is almost constantly changing. The clouds are moving, the light is changing. So I think that the lesson that I took away from that, even though I don't do plein air any longer, is that now when I became purely a studio painter, was this idea that you don't get too precious about what you're doing, and you have to be open to inventing and interpreting and modifying things.
Now, we talked about your brushes just because they were so indicative of how you paint. But is there anything else that really influences the way you come out in these paintings? Like, do you have a favorite substrate, a favorite canvas, or anything like that at all? Or is it just mostly just your paints and your brushes that really bring it to life?
I'd say it's mostly the paints and brushes. I like to paint. I paint on both canvas and smooth panels. I tend to work, and they're a little different. Although when I'm working on a large scale, I tend to just stretch a canvas. It's just a lot easier than trying to use a panel. A panel, they both have their pros and cons. A panel can be nice because the smoothness can give you a really slick painting surface. Sometimes it may be a little bit easier to scrape the paint and get a certain marks with a scraper on a hard surface than a canvas, or at least a stretched canvas, which has some bounce to give to it. But I don't really have like a special. I don't use a very heavy canvas. It tends to be either a medium to a fine weave.
Okay, I was gonna ask if it's gonna be a smooth canvas or even a linen. I would think, but
Yeah, I would use linen.
okay. So if I sent you some gesso cardboard, you'd be able to paint on that.
Well, I could, yeah, I mean, I could probably do it, sure. I mean, you can paint on any number of things,
Yeah.
just as long as it does. I wouldn't paint on bare wood. You wouldn't
Yeah,
want to paint on something where the oil is getting sucked into the.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Thanks for that. Now, here's a couple questions for you. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given, if you can remember it?
Well, I saw that question and I thought about that. Okay, so here's my answer to that. Sadly, I can't really give you a specific answer to that because I was very young when I went to art school, and I wasn't exactly a model student. I wasn't really, I don't think I was a very good student. So I don't really think I took advantage of what I could have learned so much from instructors. So in other words, I guess if I had to answer that in a nutshell, I'd say, I don't know what the best advice was because I wasn't listening carefully enough. And yeah, and that's
Hey, that's fair. That's an honest answer, without a doubt. We did have a question come in about your paint. Do you use Michael Harding exclusively, or do you kind of mix up brands?
I don't use any Michael Harding.
Oh, okay.
I have endorsed, I guess you'd say, or certain brands. For a long while, I was using Gamblin for several years, but then this past year, I switched to M. Graham, which is made in Oregon, and it's very nice paint. It's made with walnut oil, so
Oh,
it's got a creamier texture to it, and it takes a little longer to dry, but it's really nice paint.
oh, interesting. You find the walnut oil creamier than linseed oil.
I think it's a thinner, lighter oil.
Oh, okay. I had no idea. That's interesting.
Yeah, and safflower as well is a little lighter.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
but like I said, the only downside is that they take a little longer to dry.
So I guess that having the creamier paints would work in the style you paint in. So do you even need any mediums with that paint?
It's funny you should ask that because it seems like since I've been using the M. Graham, I'm not using as much medium. But I do use medium. I use an alkyd medium.
Okay,
I,
just to speed it up, right?
yeah, but And I also use, M-Gram makes a fast drying white, which is basically just titanium white with an alkyd mixed or added to it so that it just speeds up the drying. So I find that, in using that white with the other colors, that kind of counteracts the slow drying time. And it's creamy enough that I don't need to use much medium.
I'm very curious though on what artists inspire you, and I'm not talking about the old painters, Rembrandt and all those people, but is there any modern painters that inspire you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of contemporary painters that I like to look at. They're not necessarily really well known. I mean, as far as like if I chose like Lucian Freud might be somebody who's like a bigger, well-known painter that I've really enjoyed looking at. I remember starting to look at his work back during the period of time when I began experimenting, out of art school, and then started trying different painting approaches, looking at his work, a little bit of Francis Bacon, and then I have contemporary painters that I like. I should be able to rattle them off, but I'll just say there's a bunch of them. I don't have a list of them in front of me, but there's a lot of different. Let's put it this way: the painters who tend to do something that's a little more unique or more individual, I think, tend to inspire me a bit more.
Lucian and Bacon, that says so much to me. As soon as you said their names, I thought, oh yeah, for sure, that fits into not how you paint, but that kind of has that essence in them as well.
Yeah, it's that sense of aesthetic.
Yes.
I mean, I gravitate toward. I feel like I'm a very painterly painter. My
Yes.
paintings are very much about using paint, and they have been for a long time. So I like painters who also use paint. I feel like if you're going, well, I mean, this is and this isn't to make a value judgment, but these days I am more intrigued and more excited when I look at paintings that have a palpable texture to them rather than smooth surface. I mean, I like those paintings too, and I do occasionally still paint that way, but I just really love the texture of paint. I think I've always loved looking at that in painting.
Yeah, and it shows in your work as well, for sure. And that kind of brings me to a question, just a random question. How much paint do you go through for a larger piece? Like, do you put the entire tube onto your palette and it's gone by the end, or are you more conservative?
Well, yeah, that's a good question.
Like, do you paint like a millionaire and just dump it all on?
No, I paint like a very cheap, stingy painter. I do, but I tend to, maybe it's because I do a lot of paintings with flesh color in them, Caucasian flesh. What's flesh color anyway? So I tend to use a lot of white. I go through a lot of white, more than probably anything else.
Gotcha.
So I could go through, say, 150 milliliter, or I think like M. Graham sells, they're measured in ounce, like a 5-ounce tube of paint, a white tube of paint in a week or so.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. And that's not even really packing it on. I've seen paintings in museums where the paint is really packed on and think, well, unless you're mixing like cold wax into it or something like that, you've got to have a big supply of paint.
Oh, yeah. I remember seeing some Group of Seven paintings in the gallery in Canada. And Tom Thompson, when he paints, it's so thick on these large paintings. And I'm just thinking, how do you get that much paint?
Mm-hmm.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that. I appreciate that. One last question before we give it up here. I wanted to ask you, what's the top piece of advice you would give others or even yourself about 5 years ago?
Well, if I'm talking to myself, to be more open, but then again, I wouldn't have been listening anyway. Yeah, assuming I were listening and interested, yeah, to be more open and to, have a broader way of looking at things, and try not to get too narrow in your perspective, in the way that, in the way that you think of painting, and the way that you define it. I think I probably would have benefited from that if I had allowed that thought or idea to penetrate my very thick skull when I was 20 years old. And as far as advice to others, I mean, I guess it just depends on where they are, what they're trying to do.
What if it was to be more generic? Would there be any advice you can give an artist?
Oh, well, paint what you want to paint. Because at the end of the day, as I said earlier when we were talking, no one becomes a painter for any other reason than that they feel like they need to paint, or they have a love of painting, or for self-expression. no one does it for the money, that's for sure. So if you're going to do that, I think then paint the things that you want to be painting. That's definitely something else I would tell my younger self. Paint the things that you want to be painting, because I feel like when I want to be able to say when I get older, I painted this painting because it had to be painted. I had to paint that painting, and I did it.
Well, that's a great piece of advice. I love that. I think it's perfect. I never thought of it that way. Like you say, we get into art because we love it. Then why stop loving it and then stop painting what you want to paint, right? So I love that advice. Thank you very much.
But
That's
it can
great.
happen.
Oh yeah, I've heard it. People doing commissions or people painting for other artists painting for galleries and stuff like that. I've heard those stories before. Yeah,
And I have those stories myself. But anyway, like I said, what I've learned is I think for myself, if you have the kind of a personality or a temperament that I do, then you have to do what feels good to you or what makes sense to you.
absolutely. Thank you. And with that note, I want to say thank you for everyone who participated and watched tonight's inspirational interview. I want to thank everybody who asked questions, and of course, I want to thank David. I very much appreciate you coming in and talk. It was exceeded my expectations. It was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about my work.
Excellent. And with that, if you're interested in Artful Minds, check us out at artfulminds.ca. If you want to see past interviews, go to the community.artfulminds.ca in the open studio section. And of course, if you want to look at David's work, check him out at davidshevlino.com. All right. Thank you very much, David. And thank you to everybody else. Have a good evening.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye bye.